In 2006, police found a man covered in his own blood, standing over his dead girlfriend. The case seemed solved in seconds, but what detectives didn't realize was that they were interrogating a man who had been shot in the head twice and was actively dying while they demanded confessions. This is the story of 3 cases where the most obvious assumption was dead wrong, and the consequences were catastrophic. Welcome back. Today we're examining a pattern that runs through some of the darkest corners of modern crime, the moments when assumptions override evidence, when the narrative gets locked in so early that nobody stops to ask the right questions. I'm talking about 3 cases separated by geography and circumstance, but united by one terrifying truth. Sometimes the real horror isn't the crime itself, it's what happens after the crime, when the system that's supposed to protect us makes everything infinitely worse. Let's start with Ryan Waller. January 2006, Omaha, Nebraska. A call comes into police, shots fired at a residential address. When officers arrive, they find a scene of absolute violence. A woman, Ryan Waller's girlfriend, is dead, and standing over her body is Ryan himself, dazed, disoriented, covered in blood. The detective's mind makes a decision in seconds. Ryan killed her. It's the obvious conclusion. He's at the scene, he's covered in blood, he's acting strange, and it will be the most catastrophic mistake of his life. For hours, detectives pepper Waller with questions, but his answers don't make sense. He's mumbling, incoherent, contradictory. Some officers think he's on drugs. Others think he's being deliberately evasive, that classic criminal tactic of playing dumb. Where's the gun, Ryan? I don't know. Did you shoot her? No, I don't. His responses are exactly what guilty behavior looks like, the detectives think. His lack of clarity, his inability to give straight answers, classic signs of deception or intoxication. But here's what no one was asking. What if his brain literally couldn't form the answers they needed? The truth was nightmarish. Ryan Waller had been shot in the head, not once, twice, during a home invasion that he had survived but not intact. The bullets had caused catastrophic brain damage. When police found him at the scene, he wasn't being evasive, he was suffering from massive neurological trauma. His inability to speak clearly, his confusion, his disorientation, these weren't signs of guilt, they were signs that his brain was literally shutting down. While detectives were interrogating him for hours, pressing him for confessions, Ryan Waller was dying. He needed emergency surgery. He needed medical intervention. Instead, he was being treated as a suspect in his girlfriend's murder. The real tragedy, the case was later solved through actual investigation, and Ryan had nothing to do with it. He was innocent, he always was. But for hours, while he was in critical condition, the system had already decided his fate. It's a stunning example of how quickly assumptions can calcify into certainty. How a scenario, any scenario that fits the narrative, can override the most basic human compassion. Ryan Waller didn't just survive a home invasion, he survived the system meant to protect him turning against him at his most vulnerable moment. But the next case we're looking at today, that one went much darker. Anchorage, Alaska, 2012. An 18-year-old barista named Samantha Koenig goes to work at a coffee stand like she does every day. She's young, vibrant, her whole life ahead of her. What happens next sets in motion one of the most disturbing ransom scenarios in American crime history. She's abducted by a serial killer named Israel Keys, a man whose cruelty went far beyond the act of murder itself, a man who understood that the psychological torture could be just as devastating as the physical act. Days after Samantha's disappearance, her family receives a photograph. It shows Samantha, alive, holding a newspaper from days after her abduction. The date on the newspaper proves she's still breathing, still alive. For her family, this is the first glimmer of hope. Yes, their daughter has been taken. Yes, they're being demanded to pay ransom, but she's alive. There's a chance. There's a path forward. The photo becomes their lifeline. It becomes proof, evidence, a reason to believe that if they pay, if they do what Keyes demands, they might get their daughter back. They had no idea what they were actually looking at. Samantha Koenig was already dead. Keyes had murdered her days before sending that photograph. But he needed the ransom money, so he did something that defies comprehension. He took her corpse and he got to work. He sewed her eyelids open, applied makeup to her dead face, positioned her body to make her appear conscious, aware, alive. Then he propped her up with a newspaper and took the photograph that would devastate her family. It's not just murder, it's not just abduction, it's a deliberate, calculated act of psychological torture aimed at the people who loved her most. Keyes was extracting money by dangling the false hope of his victim's survival, by forcing her family to stare at the corpse of their daughter and interpret it as proof of life. And it worked. The ransom was demanded. Samantha's debit card was used across multiple states. Keyes extracted money from her account, living off the proceeds of his victim, extending his sick fantasy for as long as possible. What finally brought Keyes down wasn't the ransom, it was digital forensics, a digital breadcrumb trail following the debit card usage across state lines. Eventually, authorities traced him to Texas. He was captured, prosecuted. He eventually took his own life in prison. But the case reveals something deeply disturbing about the nature of modern serial killers. Keyes wasn't satisfied with murder alone. He had to extend the horror. He had to involve the family. He had to turn the act of murder into a prolonged psychological weapon. It's predatory behavior taken to an almost incomprehensible extreme. And yet, as dark as this case is, the next one we're covering shows a different kind of horror altogether. Vienna, Austria, a hospital. 4 women worked as nurses' aides caring for elderly and infirmed patients. On the surface, they seemed like dedicated healthcare workers, but behind closed doors, they were engaged in a systematic spree of murders. They called themselves, or were called by others, the Line's Angels of Death. The question of their motivation would divide investigators, criminologists, and the public. Were these women engaged in a twisted form of mercy killing, or were they pure sadists, using their access to vulnerable patients as an opportunity to indulge in murder? Their methods varied, but each one reveals something chilling about premeditation and access. Morphine overdoses were common. These women had access to medications that could kill silently. A patient in pain could be given a mercy dose that was actually a lethal injection. No one would question it. Elderly patients die in hospitals. It happens. But morphine overdoses were just the beginning. Some of their victims were drowned, not in a bathtub, not in any way that might draw suspicion. These women would fill the lungs of helpless, bedridden patients with water, essentially drowning them while they lay paralyzed in their hospital beds. Patients who couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't fight back. Other methods included insulin overdoses, suffocation, starvation, the arsenal of a killer with unlimited access to vulnerable victims and the medical knowledge to make it look natural. The chilling part, they got away with it for years, potentially decades. No one was asking questions. Elderly patients die in hospitals. It happens. The deaths were attributed to natural causes, to the frailty of age, to the inevitable decline of the infirmed. What finally exposed them wasn't forensic evidence or a whistleblower. It wasn't a detective following a hunch. It was arrogance. One evening, the four women were at a local tavern, drinking and socializing like any other group of friends. But they made a catastrophic mistake. They started talking, openly, brazenly, discussing their secrets, boasting about what they'd done. Someone overheard them, someone reported them, and suddenly a pattern that had gone undetected for years was exposed. Authorities launched an investigation. They exhumed bodies, they reviewed medical records, they conducted autopsies, and the scope of the killings became clear, potentially dozens of victims, maybe more. Here's where this case becomes philosophically disturbing. The women themselves claimed they were acts of mercy. They said they were putting infirm people out of their misery, ending suffering, providing a final compassionate exit for people who were in pain. But the evidence, the sheer number of victims, the methods used, the escalation, the arrogance, the boasting, suggests something far darker. This wasn't mercy. This was sadism. This was access to vulnerable people being weaponized for personal gratification. The difference between euthanasia and murder is consent. These patients never consented. They couldn't consent. They were helpless. And that helplessness was exactly what made them targets. It's one of the most troubling cases in modern European crime because it forces us to ask, how do we distinguish between someone who genuinely believes they're merciful and someone who's using that belief as a justification for pure sadism? Maybe the answer is, we can't. The results are the same either way. Dead victims who had no voice, no choice, and no defense. 3 cases, 3 different countries, 3 different circumstances, but they share something profound. In Ryan Waller's case, assumptions over guilt overrode the most basic humanity. A man was interrogated while dying because the narrative had already been written. In Samantha Koenig's case, a serial killer weaponized false hope itself, turning the search for her victim into a prolonged psychological torture for her family. And in the Lyons Angels case, access to vulnerability became access to murder. A system designed to care became a system of predation. Each case shows us something different about how systems fail, how assumptions calcify, how access to the vulnerable can be weaponized, how the psychological component of crime, the suffering inflicted on families, on innocents, on people just trying to do the right thing, can be just as devastating as the physical act. These aren't just stories about criminals, they're stories about how easily systems can fail the people they're meant to protect. If you found these cases as disturbing and fascinating as I do, there's more where this came from. We dive deep into cases like these, the system failures, the psychological patterns, the moments when the obvious answer is dead wrong. Subscribe for more deep dives into true crime cases that challenge how we think about justice, guilt, and the systems we rely on. And let me know in the comments, which of these cases disturbed you most, and what do you think it says about our systems that these things can happen? Thanks for watching.